He hasn't loaded the sled yet, but dragging it up the steep snow-covered road is hard work. This, he says, is why the pay is so good. Only a few days earlier, he lost his good friend and fellow worker who had been 3 years his senior. When Kaim happened along, the young man asked him if he would help by pushing the sled from behind until they cleared the pass. Kaim agreed, and they became an instant team. Jeez. Kaim circles around to the back of the sled and asks, "You don't have any animals to pull the sled?" "Afraid not," says the young man. "I know it's strange, but our horses and cattle and donkeys all die young. You can spend a lot of money at the town market buying an animal, and it'll keel over before it's done a lick of work. Finally, the best way is for us humans to plough the fields and pull the sleds ourselves." The arms with which the young man himself is pulling the sled are massive, and he forges through the road's snowy cover with his powerful steps. His fellow worker was stronger still, he says. "He taught me how to pull the sled, how to set rabbit traps, how to build a fire, all the skills I need to live. With all the love he would give to a kid brother, before I knew it, he was gone. People here always die suddenly," he says. "They can be perfectly healthy one minute and drop dead the next. No time for suffering, just like that. No time to call a doctor. Even if a doctor comes, there's nothing he can do. Did your friend die that way?" "Uh-huh." "He was shoveling the snow that piled up overnight, clearing the road. When he dropped dead, by the time we ran over to help him, he was gone. That's how it always is. Always. That's how they die. Grown-ups, kids, everyone." Wow. And you too, then? I guess so. Nobody knows when the moment is coming. It might be decades from now, or it could be tomorrow. After this cool pronouncement, the young man turns to look at Kaim and, pointing to his own chest, says with a smile, "Or maybe, even now." The smile is genuine, without a hint of despair or bitterness towards the cruelty of his fate. "Aren't you afraid to die?" Kaim starts to ask him, but stops himself. It's a stupid question, he decides, and one that he is not qualified to ask. Where could a man burdened with eternal life find appropriate words to speak to a man burdened with the threat of sudden death? Kaim and the young man keep dragging the sled up the steep mountain path. Their destination is a lake beyond the pass. The young man's job calls for him to cut ice from the surface of the frozen lake and transport it back to the village. We in the village call the lake the Spring of Life. If you trace the source of the water that bubbles out of the ground here and there in the village, you always wind up at the Spring of Life. Kaim nods silently. The ice from the Spring of Life takes forever to melt. That's why, look, you can even do this. Again, the young man takes a piece of the crystal candy, or rather ice, from his leather pouch and puts it in his mouth. It gives you energy. It's indispensable when doing hard work, or for pregnant women or infants. Just put a piece in your mouth and it gives you instant strength. The young man offers a piece to Kaim, who nods again in silence. "We're not really supposed to give any to outsiders, but you're special because I'm putting you to work. If I give it to you, though, I want you to help me load the ice on the sled. I can handle it by myself on the way back." Kaim silently accepts the ice from the young man, who assures him it tastes good too, and watches him. Smiling, Kaim averts his gaze somewhat and puts the piece in his mouth. "You gonna hear a crunch noise?" The ice should be nothing but frozen water, but it has a mild sweetness, just as Kaim expected. He spits it out when the young man is not looking. Poison. I know that taste, thinks Kaim. No wonder. The village people are used to this taste, so they think nothing of it. Without a doubt, though, there is poison in the ice. The long flow of time smooths over the wounds inflicted by history. The permanently snow-capped peaks make people forget the existence of the wide world on the other side. The young man calls this lake the Spring of Life, but for those who lived far beyond the mountains, at the source of the river that feeds the lake, used to know it as the Pit of Death. Long ago, several hundred years ago, the entire area around the river's source was polluted with the poisonous metallic outflow from a mine. The river was filled with dead fish floating belly up, and the poisonous gas that rose like a mist from the ground killed both the earthbound animals and the birds in the sky. The forest withered, and the lively town that had grown up with the development of the mine became a deserted ruin. Oh dear. Nature took many years to recover, but the forest eventually turned green again, which attracted small animals and eventually the large animals that hunted them. People, however, never came back, and there was no one left to hand down the story of the tragedy that occurred at the river's source deep in the mountains. The only one who knows everything that happened is Kaim, the man who has lived 1,000 years. The young man stands by the frozen lake and takes a nice satisfying stretch. "You know," he says to the traveller, "I sometimes think this village just might be the closest one to heaven in the whole world. Perhaps it's because we are too close to heaven that we are all summoned by the gods early on. Don't you think that might be true? Kaim says nothing in response to this. Over many years, this lake has accumulated the metallic poison that flowed into it from upstream, and over many years the poison that infiltrated the soil has mingled with the groundwater, bubbling up in the spring water with which the villagers slake their thirsts. No one knows the exact chemical makeup of the poison, but at least it does not cause the villagers to suffer until at the last moment of their lives. The accumulated poison suddenly takes its toll. This may be its one fortunate aspect. On the other hand, this might simply make the misfortune it brings all the more conspicuous. Still, the young man says as he saws off a piece of ice by the shore, I do hope that the children my wife and I will... Children that my wife and I have will be able to live longer lives. Say, if we have 5, at least one of them will live long enough to grow up and have kids. That way, for me, it would be like finding some meaning in having been born into this world. It was the same with my father and mother and my grandparents. They all had lots of kids and mourned the loss of lots of kids, but managed to raise 1 or 2 to adulthood before they died. That's what gives our life meaning. He wipes the sweat from his brow and puts another piece of ice candy in his mouth. If I were to tell him everything I know, thinks Kaim, if I were to tell him everything that has been buried in the darkness of history, and if he were to tell the other villagers, the tragedy might not have to be repeated. The young man says, when a baby is born here, they ring the village bell. Also when someone dies. The same for both. Birth and death are like 2 sides of the same coin. So there's no sadness when someone dies. Everybody sees them off with a smile and wish, you go ahead of us to heaven and save a good spot there for us. Do you understand that sentiment? I do, says Kaim. I do. That's how we've always done it, welcoming lots of new lives to the village and sending lots of lives off to heaven. I've never been much of a student, so I don't know exactly how to put this, but I kind of think that maybe the village closest to heaven is a place where life and death are right next door to each other. The young man gives Kaim an embarrassed smile at the sound of his own words. Maybe it's because I'm about to have a kid of my own that I'm starting to think about these complicated things. No, that's fine. I see exactly what you mean, Kaim says. The moment the words leave his mouth, a bell sounds from the foot of the hill. Several long slow rings. That's it, exclaims the young man. My child has been born. He dips his head and says again, as if savouring the sound of his own words. My child! While the bell is rung likewise for births and deaths, the young man says the sound in each case is subtly different. When a young villager learns to tell the 2 apart, he or she is considered to be an adult. I hope this one lives a long time, the young man says, choking with the flood of emotions that show on his face. But then he goes on, as if to negate his own hopes for the future. Either way, whether it lives a long time or not, my child has now been born into this world. That's all that matters. I'm so happy, so happy. Eyes full of tears, he turns a beatific smile on Kaim, and then, still smiling, he collapses where he stands. He died. Oh no. Kaim lays the young man's corpse on the sled and returns to the village. As the young man said, the villagers accept his death with the same smiles they had for the birth of his baby. Death is not the time for sorrow, it simply marks whether one has been called to heaven earlier or later. The young man's wife takes an ice candy from the leather pouch he has left behind and places it gently into the baby's mouth. I want you to grow up to be strong and healthy, she says. Daddy is saving a wonderful place for you up in heaven. But go there slowly, slowly, and until you go to heaven, I want you to grow up here in the village till you're nice and big. Her words have the gentle tone of a lullaby. Kaim says nothing. If he is to stand unflinchingly for what is right, his silence may be a crime, but burdened with eternal life, Kaim knows how suspect the right can be. Throughout history, people have fought and wounded, and killed each other in the name of what they declare to be right. By comparison, the look on the dead young man's face is tranquility itself. The village closest to heaven is filled with happiness indeed. The baby starts to cry, its loud wailing like a celebration of the beginning of its own life, however short that life is likely to be. Kaim leaves the village with a smile on his face. The village bell begins to peal. Peal? I don't know how else you could say that. Reverberating with utter clarity through the distant mountains as if to bestow a blessing on the young man who lived life to the fullest with neither resentment nor regret. And when this too long life of mine draws to a close, Kaim thinks, I like to be sent off with the sound of bells like this if possible, because he knows that day will never come. Kaim walks on, never stopping, never looking back. His long journey is far from over. End. Yay! 2 down, 2 to go. Woo! That was a good one. I believe that one's done, so now we can go to... Maybe... wait, should I exit? Can I just go into one of these? Just go into one of these and then that should trigger it. It's because they're in the same area. It screws things up, I think. Now if I go to the middle... There you go. Good. Phew! And... there we go. Another dream. The waterfall lies deep in the forest, more than a day's travel from the nearest village. It is said to be a holy place. In search of the divine amid the towering peaks, pilgrims stand beneath the plunging falls in their final ascetic practice. The water of the falls is freezing cold. All it takes is a momentary lapse of concentration, and the purser is hammered down by the rushing water. Stones of Heaven. The pilgrims call this waterfall the Stones of Heaven. Heaven is testing their mental and physical strength, they say, by hurling an endless stream of stones down upon them in the form of the powerful waterfall. And the stones have a mysterious power. A former pilgrim says to Kaim with a pained smile. He himself failed in his final austerity, he adds. Different stones of heaven fall on each person. It's as if they can see into your heart. What do you mean? Kaim asks. The burdens you bore and the dreams you dreamed in the secular world appear to you one after another. In his own case, he says, what came to him first were the voices of women. The water plunging down into the basin of the falls began to sound like women's voices. Sweet voices whispering in my ear, voices sobbing, voices moaning in a lover's embrace. An incredible variety, and for better or worse, I knew every single one of them. Some I was thrilled to hear again, while others I hated remembering. Meaning you've gotten yourself into a lot of trouble involving women. I have indeed. Not to boast or anything, but that was one battlefield I knew better than anybody. I survived, but I made a lot of women cry, and there were a lot of them I loved. My whole purpose is undertaking the austerities... Wait. Oh, was to put that life behind me, but the Stones of Heaven know what they are doing. In the final test, they go after your greatest weakness. If you waver the slightest bit, you've had it. The water slams you down, and your austerities are over. The man feeds a stick of kindling into the campfire. And I'm not the only one, he continues. One fellow heard the voice of the mother he hadn't seen since he was a little boy. Another heard the voice of his dead child. Is it always voices? I wish it were. If you hold up through the voices, the waterfall's mist starts changing into the shapes of people. You might see somebody you hated so much in the secular world that you wanted to kill him, or it might be some loan shark you had to go into hiding to get away from. One little flinch and you're done for. This particular austerity can be performed only once. There are no second chances. Someone who has persevered for a whole day and night, but who fails in the end, has no choice but to return to the secular world in defeat, as this man did. Not that it was easy for me to get on my feet again, once I was back there either. The man chuckles and calls out to a young pilgrim, or more precisely, to a young man who was a pilgrim until a few moments ago. but who has just now dragged himself up to the lip of the basin in utter dejection. "Hey, young fellow, the campfire's over here. I've got liquor to warm up your insides and some fresh grilled meat.